South Africa's economy continues to be impacted by external factors such as the Russia and Ukraine war. Policy settings by major central banks were too loose through 2021 in an effort to alleviate pressure which was caused by the pandemic. However, this, on the other hand, has exacerbated the nation's current problems. Policymakers now regret these decisions. Hugo Ribatika joins us from the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation's Inclusive Growth Forum in the Drakensberg. Hugo, a number of thought leaders speaking at that particular get-together. Talk us through the latest there.
Well, you're absolutely right. As you said in that intro, we have the governor of the central bank with us just to unpack some of those issues, and obviously all seemingly very, very complicated. Governor, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, for the average man, life is becoming extremely difficult because of inflation, and that for us is the basis. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Can you talk us through why we are seeing these challenges in inflation, not just in South Africa, but across the globe?
Yes, inflation is a problem across the globe, but it's not just that we are having inflation rising. The world is facing an environment of rising inflation and slowing economic growth. There could be a debate about the sources of inflation. Initially, it was that we had what was called global supply constraints. What do we mean? What we had was that the economies were under lockdown during COVID, and that when the economies reopened, a lot of production couldn't catch up with the rising demand. And so you had those concerns. Secondly, there was the war in Ukraine, which then also further disrupted production, mainly of fertilizer, and impacted on food, because both countries are important producers of fertilizer and of food. And so a combination of those led to a rise in prices. But besides, advanced economy central banks had provided liquidity and extraordinary support during COVID. We all did, but they had been doing it even before COVID. What that meant was that money had to find a place, and as the economies opened, those monies were beginning to be spent. So a combination. So what you are seeing here, I know some people think that it's just a pure supply driver of the inflation, but there are also the demand aspects now that are coming in. The problem is that as demand is rising at the time when the economic the potential of most economies has actually been reduced, which means that demand catches up with supply much quicker than it had done in the past. You and I we are salaried individuals, and because we are salaried individuals, we probably can only negotiate a salary increase once a year. If inflation comes out higher than our salary settlements, we are faced with a situation where our salaries are buying less goods and services than before. So in other words, inflation erodes the buying power of your earnings. And it could be worse. You could just be a recipient of a social grant. And if you are just a recipient of a social grant, you can't even negotiate an increase, because government makes a decision and says, this is what is going to be the increase. And the increase might not be catching up with inflation. And as such, the buying power of the social grant reduces. So where does the central bank come in? The central bank comes in by having to rein in inflation so that your income is protected going forward.
Now, is this likely to be short-term, or can we expect the impact of this over the next couple of years even?
Well, by its very nature, monetary policy is short-term, and short-term for monetary policy means 12 to 18 months. And in our horizon, we expect that inflation next year will come down to 5.3%. We think that the peak, that is the highest inflation would have been in the third quarter of this year, and that next year we will decline to 5.3%, and by 2024 we will be at 4.6, about closer to the 4.5% target that we aim for. And if that then happens, we are able to protect the buying power of your money.
Now, there has been some talk of a recession on the horizon, if we aren't in one already. What is your comment on that?
Difficult one to call. That is not our baseline scenario as the South African Reserve Bank. We had a contraction in the second quarter of this year. The third quarter, we actually think that we will still see some growth in the third quarter. We have revised our own growth for 2022 from just over 2% to 1.9%, and we've indicated that there are risks because the global economy is slowing. And with the global economy slowing down, that means the demand for South African exports is also coming down. And what has actually protected South Africa in this recovery that we had seen in 2021 had been the performance of the commodity prices. So foreigners were prepared to pay more for the commodities that South Africa produces. With the global economy slowing down, the foreigners are going to be paying less, and that means that there is a risk that our economy will slow down, hence the revision. It is not our baseline that there would be a recession, but the environment, there are so many moving parts. It might happen, but what we have seen elsewhere in the world is that economies are slowing down, and in an environment where inflation had been rising, we think that ours had peaked in the third quarter of this year, which means that it begins to decline. And if it declines as we have projected over the next 2 years, it would suggest at the moment then that South Africa is less bad than what we are seeing in the rest of the world.
Now, final thoughts. When we look at Ukraine and the war, it suggests that the world is heavily reliant on a single economy for so many of its products. I mean, you talk about grain, you talk about fertilizer. Would the solution be for countries such as South Africa or for the African continent to be more self-reliant or to be able to trade amongst themselves?
It's very important that Africans trade, we trade amongst ourselves, and that is why we have the African Free Trade Agreement, because by trading amongst ourselves, actually the evidence shows that we would all benefit from that. But even still, there is no country, neither can there be a continent that is self-sufficient. Not even China, which had been growing at one stage by double-digit, is self-sufficient. It is relying on buying commodities from countries such as South Africa and other African countries, and it is also selling stuff to us. Countries trade, and the global economy benefits from the trading between nations. So yes, you have got to take steps to mitigate the risk of over-reliance on one country, but that could mean that you should be diversifying. And let me underscore, in the case of South Africa, when it comes to food, the only thing that we had been importing from Ukraine had been wheat. For the rest of the food, South African agricultural sector has done very well. Agricultural production has been good. And yes, the fertilizer is not like we are not getting the fertilizer. It's just that the fertilizer is now more expensive because there is a supplier who is out of the market.
Governor, certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Motlanthe, we were speaking obviously to the Reserve Bank Governor, unpacking what would have seemed complicated issues around some of the finances and certainly the inflation that we are experiencing in the country, but which for all intents and purposes is likely to be short-term. Back to you.